I have replaced industrial planers and entire roofs. I did not expect my eyes to be next. Dr. Arlo called the macular repair routine a word favoured by those who do not rely on a master joiner's hand. I gave my 3 children exactly 42 days to prepare for the 2 weeks I would spend in total darkness. I did not know it yet, but the furniture I had built for them was far sturdier than the people I had raised. Do you think a child's love is something to be expected, or something that must be earned through presence? The recovery clinic was located deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, though for the first 72 hours, location was a concept that had no meaning to me. It was a private, self-funded recovery suite, a luxury I paid for in full, to ensure my healing wouldn't be a burden to anyone who didn't truly want to be there. I chose this solitude over the hollow comfort of a home filled with absent faces. I woke up in a world where sound was the only currency and darkness was the only landscape. The smell of high-grade antiseptic was constant, sharp and clinical, like the edge of a fresh industrial planer. My eyes were heavily bandaged, a necessary precaution to ensure the delicate macular repair held its integrity. Dr. Arlo had been clear. Any sudden movement or strain during the first 14 days could result in permanent loss. I had been a master joiner for 40 years, so I understood the stakes. If the alignment is off at the start, the whole structure eventually fails. I sat in that silence, waiting for the sound of the door opening, for a voice I recognized to break the static of the machines. I had given Justin, Samantha, and Tyler exactly 42 days of lead time. In my mind, I had already cleared a space for them. I expected Justin's authoritative step, Samantha's perfume, or even Tyler's restless energy. Instead, the only tactile connection I had to the world was the digital vibration of my phone on the metal bedside table. It would hum a brief, stuttering notification and then return to silence. They missed the intake. They missed the surgery. They missed the critical window when the pain introduces itself in the middle of the night, cold and unyielding. Looking back now, I realise I had been the silent investor in their version of family for too long. I had provided the capital, the stability, and the structural support, while they had merely enjoyed the dividends. It took me until day 4 to stop reaching for the phone when it vibrated. By day 7, the silence in the room had acquired a weight of its own. Nurse Elena was the only one who entered my orbit. She was a professional, efficient, quiet, and possessed of a hand squeeze that carried more genuine concern than any of the text messages I could not even read. It was during those long, dark hours that I began to understand a fundamental truth. Solitude is a choice one makes to find peace, but loneliness is an imposition forced upon you by the absence of those who should be there. I had spent my life building things that stayed level and true, but as I sat in that clinic bed, I realised my children had overdrafted on my compassion for years. They viewed my self-sufficiency as a permanent feature, an excuse to avoid the messy labour of actual care. If I am being honest, I think they had already mentally liquidated my estate, viewing me as an asset that no longer required maintenance. The friction of the recovery was immense. The fear of a slip, the physical helplessness, but it was nothing compared to the clarity that comes from total abandonment. I did not need them to pay me back. I just needed them to show up. And in the 14-day eclipse of my sight, their absence was the only thing I could see with perfect clarity. I spent 40 years seasoning the timber of their character, or so I thought. I built the Vance Heritage Brand on a single principle: the integrity of the grain. In my workshop, we do not use nails or screws to hide a weak connection. We use joinery. The strength of the piece comes from how the wood is cut to fit into itself a relationship of mutual support and physical reality. I applied that same philosophy to my children. I funded Justin's Master of Business Administration at $18,000 a semester. I covered Samantha's corporate housing when she started her consulting firm. I absorbed the losses from Tyler's 3 failed tech ventures, without a single lecture on financial responsibility. I believed I was providing the foundation they needed to stand on their own. Instead, I was merely building a soft environment that prevented them from ever becoming structural beams. In retrospect, it's clear that inherited status often carries a specific kind of entropy. When you provide the finish before the wood has been properly seasoned, it looks beautiful on the surface, but it cannot bear a load. My children had become polished veneers. As I lay in the clinic, I found myself mentally walking through my workshop back in the mountains. I could smell the linseed oil and the sharp, sweet scent of walnut shavings. In my mind's eye, I saw the stool at my primary workbench. It has sat there for 20 years, a silent invitation for an apprentice. I had always hoped that one of them would eventually want to sit there, to learn the quiet discipline of the craft, to understand that a thing is only as good as its hidden joints. But the stool remained empty. They were too busy managing the image of success I had gifted them to bother with the work of actually building anything. They saw the workshop as a line item on a balance sheet, a collection of old-growth timber and real estate currently valued at $1,800,000. To them, my life was a countdown to a liquidation event. I never asked them for a transaction. I never asked for a return on my investment. I only asked them to sit in that clinic chair for one afternoon. Sitting there, in the dark, I understood that some forms of dependence remain invisible until you stop cooperating. I was the load-bearing wall they had forgotten to maintain. And as I listened to the hollow echoes of their digital excuses, I decided it was time to let the structure settle. Samantha's phone calls were masterpieces of corporate deflection. She would call at precisely 2 p.m., a slot clearly carved out between her client briefings and executive meetings. I could hear the aggressive, percussive clacking of her keyboard and the muffled, urgent voices of her assistants in the background. Her affection was a subscription where I was the only one footing the bill, and she was currently looking for a way to cancel the service without losing the benefits. She used the phrase, of course, "Dad," exactly 4 times in 4 minutes, a rhythmic, hollow sincerity designed to end the call as quickly as possible without a single concrete commitment to visit. She even weaponized my grandchildren's soccer schedule as a tactical shield, explaining why a 3-hour drive was an insurmountable logistical challenge. During the very week my sight hung in the balance. Tyler called on day 4. His voice carried the familiar, frantic cadence of a man standing on the edge of a self-inflicted financial disaster. He didn't ask how my eyes were healing, or if the pain was manageable. He told me about a snag in his latest disruptive business venture. He mentioned a bridge loan, a temporary influx of capital to tide him over until a phantom investor supposedly cut a check. I sat there in my bandages, listening to the background noise of a noisy airport lounge, and I realized that he didn't see a father recovering from surgery. He saw an emergency reserve that was currently, inconveniently, unavailable for withdrawal. But it was Justin who finally crossed the line. On day 5, he called from the interior of his car. There was no pretense of concern, no "how are you," just a direct pivot to business. He told me he was reviewing the Vance Heritage files and noticed that the insurance for the old-growth timber reserve was due for a valuation update. I realized then that he was attempting to exploit the limited power of attorney I had granted him years ago for basic business operations. He didn't need my physical signature for the bank's final verification. He just needed those digital codes to bypass the secondary security layer on the assets he had already surreptitiously leveraged. He asked me for the digital passcodes to the secure vault, where the land deeds and the timber inventory were kept. He said it was purely a procedural move, just to update the insurance. Looking at it today, the depth of his entitlement is staggering. Justin didn't see the master artisan who had spent 40 years preserving that forest. He saw a redevelopment opportunity that was nearing its expiration date. I sat in that clinical silence, the darkness pressing heavy against my bandages, and I realized that some people don't see family as a bond. They see it as a resource to be managed until it's depleted. I didn't realize at the time just how deep the rot went, but I began to feel the shift in the grain. I gave him the wrong passcodes. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it as a stress test. I wanted to see if he would call back to check on my health, or if his next call would be a frustration-filled demand for the correct numbers. If I am being honest, I think I already knew the answer. Justin didn't realise that my insurance update was actually the first blueprint for a dismantling project he wasn't prepared to handle. On day 7, Nurse Elena finally asked the question. She was adjusting my vitals, monitor the rhythmic hiss of the blood pressure cuff, the only sound in the room, when she paused. I could feel her gaze on the empty chair beside my bed, the one I had memorised through tactile deprivation. She asked, very softly, if I had family. I said yes. It was a single syllable that felt like a structural failure in my chest. I had family in the way a building has a facade, beautiful to the passers-by, but completely non-functional when the foundation begins to settle. I did not spend the night in self-pity. If I am being honest, I have always believed that a man's character is revealed not by his words, but by his presence when the load is heaviest. My children had shown me their measurements. Now, it was time for me to provide a structural solution. I responded with the same cold precision I used when identifying rot in a cherrywood log. I picked up the phone and called Marcus Simmons, my attorney of 26 years. Marcus is a patient man, but even he sounded hesitant when I detailed the shift I required. I told him we were no longer seasoning the timber, we were performing an emergency amputation. I needed to dissolve every legal association between the Vance Heritage Brand and the personal credit lines of my children. They had been using my reputation as collateral for a lifestyle they hadn't earned a subscription where I was the only one footing the bill. Marcus warned me about the friction. He spoke of gift tax implications, the complexity of removing co-signers, and the bank verification delays that would surely follow. I told him I had nothing but time and darkness to work with. Marcus arrived with a notary public and a second witness to ensure the process was ironclad. He spent an hour reading every single clause of the new trust aloud, while a voice recorder captured my verbal consent, establishing a clear record of my intent and mental capacity despite my physical bandages. While Elena guided my hand, I signed the documents I couldn't see. The feel of the pen against the paper was the only reality I had. I was transferring the workshop and the entire $1,800,000 old-growth timber reserve into a non-profit trade school, the Vance Apprenticeship Trust. With the benefit of clarity, I realised that some forms of dependence only become visible when you stop cooperating. I was closing the vault. In my mind, I saw the stool at the empty workbench again. It was no longer a symbol of hope. It was a designated seat for someone who would actually value the craft. I was discharged on day 14. I didn't call Justin, Samantha, or Tyler for a ride. I ordered a car from my phone and sat in the back, in a silence that felt like an internal victory. When I walked through my front door, the air in the house was stale and still. The mail was a mountain on the floor. A single plant on the windowsill had shriveled into a brown skeleton. The house was exactly as I had left it. A silent record of 14 days of total human vacancy. My vision returned in patches, hazy and unreliable at first. The house smelled of stagnant air and the peculiar silence of a structure that had been forgotten. It took 3 days for the haze to clear enough to read the finer print. I didn't go for the mail first. I accessed my secure digital archive, and the legal files, the very ones Justin had been so eager to verify for insurance purposes. My eyes were still sensitive. A stinging reminder of the delicate alignment Arlo had performed, but I knew the tactile landscape of my own files. I didn't find insurance papers. I found the shadow of a parasite. Justin had leveraged the Vance Heritage Brand as a primary guarantor for a $400,000 development loan. He had used my name, my reputation, and the equity of the timber reserve to secure financing for a strip mall project in the valley that was currently 70% vacant and hemorrhaging cash. The documents were a year old. hidden under layers of legitimate corporate filings. He hadn't just been neglectful during my surgery. He had been holding his breath, hoping I would lose my sight entirely, so the discrepancies would stay in the dark. In the cold light of day, the blurriness in my eyes was a perfect metaphor for the way he had smudged the lines between family and business. He didn't want my passcodes to update a policy. He needed my digital signature on a valuation update to prevent the bank from triggering a default on the entire $400,000 line of credit. If I didn't sign, his real estate empire would collapse by the end of the quarter. The realization didn't bring anger. Anger is a volatile material. It cracks under pressure. This was something else, a clinical understanding of a structural defect. My son was not an apprentice. He was a scavenger. He had been seasoning his own greed with my life's work. I wouldn't call the bank. I wouldn't call the police. I would simply wait for the legacy dinner I had planned. The sound of a perfectly fitted joint is silent. I invited them to the workshop on a Saturday evening, promising a dinner to discuss the future of the Vance Heritage Brand. I hosted them in the showroom gallery, where the air was filtered and the finished masterpieces gleamed under soft lights. It was a space designed to showcase the very value they were so eager to liquidate, now serving as the stage for their final audit. The air was heavy, with the scent of aged walnut and the lingering ghost of the 14 days I had spent in total darkness. I had set the table using offcuts of white oak, sanded to a glass-like finish, and placed the stool at the empty workbench in the corner as a silent guest. Justin arrived with a $2,000 bottle of single malt scotch and a smile that had been curated for a board meeting. Samantha brought an artisanal arrangement of flowers, and Tyler was uncharacteristically punctual, looking around the shop as if he were already measuring it for a floor plan. They were performing the devotion they should have offered freely, now presenting it as a late-stage investment. I watched them with the clinical detachment of a structural inspector. I realized that some forms of dependence stay invisible until you stop cooperating, and tonight I was the one withdrawing my support from a structure that had already failed. Before the first course was finished, Justin pushed a leather-bound folder across the white oak table. He said the valuation update was urgent, his voice smooth and transactional, a luxury he had overdrafted for years. He didn't mention the $400,000 loan or the failing strip mall. He only spoke of protecting the family legacy. Samantha and Tyler nodded in a practiced unison. A subscription to a lie where I was the only one footing the bill. I didn't reach for the pen. I reached for the copy of the new trust charter I had signed with Marcus while my eyes were still bandaged. I handed the documents to Justin. I told them that I had performed a stress test on our relationship during my 14-day eclipse, and the results were conclusive. The joint had failed. I explained that the Vance Heritage name, the workshop, and the $1,800,000 timber reserve had been transferred into the Vance Apprenticeship Trust. It was now a non-profit trade school. My children were no longer listed as heirs or associates. They were effectively deauthorized from the brand they had tried to cannibalize while I was blind. Justin's face went the color of raw pine as the realization settled. He wasn't just being cut out. He was now the sole guarantor of a $400,000 debt with no family equity to shield him. Tonight, I understood that forgiveness is not an invitation to a second betrayal. It is the act of removing the load from a beam that was never meant to carry it. 6 months have passed since I changed the locks. The workshop is no longer a silent vault of old-growth timber. It is a living entity, resonant with the percussive music of apprentices who actually want to learn the Vance way. I spend my mornings watching 4 young strangers, 2 women and 2 men, learn how to read the grain of a board before they ever think of touching a saw. They sit on the stool at the empty workbench I kept vacant for 20 years, and they treat the tools with a reverence my own children could never manufacture. Among them is Michael, my lead apprentice. He was the one who kept the saws humming while I was in the dark, proving that loyalty is forged through sweat, not just DNA. He earned the keys to the legacy I once blindly reserved for my own blood. Justin, Samantha and Tyler still call. If I am being honest, the tone of those conversations has shifted from a performance of entitlement to a desperate, late-stage attempt at damage control. Justin's commercial real estate venture did exactly what the math predicted. It collapsed under the weight of the $400,000 debt he had to shoulder alone. He is currently working as a mid-level manager for a firm in Raleigh, living in a rented townhouse and discovering for the first time in 45 years what it means to carry his own load. Samantha and Tyler are warmer now too. They send photographs of the grandchildren and text messages that actually contain questions about my health instead of subtle inquiries about property taxes. I accept their visits. I cook for them. I am, by every outward measure, the same warm father I have always been. But there is a structural difference now, a shift in the foundation they cannot see but can certainly feel. Thinking on it today, I realise that I had been the silent architect of their weakness for too long. By removing the safety net of the $1,800,000 legacy, I finally gave them the only thing I had ever truly denied them, the opportunity to find their own grit. It took me 72 years to understand that family is not a biological obligation. It is a structural integrity. I love my children, that part of the grain was seasoned long ago and will never change. But you can love a piece of wood and still decide it is not fit to be a structural beam. In the end, I did not destroy my family. I simply performed an audit and stopped pretending the rot wasn't there. Forgiveness, in my experience, is not about inviting the person who hurt you back into the centre of the building. It is the act of letting go of the anger so you can focus on building something that actually holds. I sit on my porch now in the thin Kentucky gold of early April. The dogwood in the front yard has made its decision and is beginning to bloom, unbothered by the lingering chill of March. I watch a cardinal land on the railing, stay for 9 seconds, and depart entirely on its own terms. My vision is sharp enough now to see the individual petals of the roses along the south fence. The trust is in Michael's hands. The workshop is full of the next generation of masters, and my affairs are in perfect clinical order. At the time of my surgery, I thought I was entering a period of darkness. Instead, I was given the 14 days of silence I needed to finally see the light. I am a master joiner, and I have learned that the most important work is often the work that stays invisible. The calculations, the stress tests, and the quiet courage to remove a failing joint before the whole structure comes down. I sit here with my tea, and the white oak cane I carved for myself years ago, a steady, reliable tool of my own making. I am a man who has built a legacy that will outlast him, and for the first time in a very long time, the silence in this house has no weight at all. Have you ever had to make the difficult choice between protecting your legacy and protecting a family member who refused to show up for you? What would you have done if the chair beside your bed stayed empty for 14 days?